But I think it's online because it's because of the text. All of that stuff is not yeah. People actually are taking surveys. Oh yeah. That's the
Okay. Your third seat. Hello, everyone. My name's Cliff Young, and I'll be the moderator of this panel. I am president of IPSOS Public Affairs. IPSOS Public Affairs is a polling and social research company here in the U.S. IPSOS writ large is a global company with offices in 90 countries. We cover 130 countries, offices in 90 though, as I was saying. And we have a great panel and a great discussion. And indeed, we're going to be talking about immigration, nativism, and changing politics. The co-sponsors are IPSOS, as I just mentioned, Texas A&M EU Center, and finally, the Bush Library and Museum. And we're super excited to have this, as I was saying, this great panel. Now, the question is, like, why are we having this? Like, what's the rationale behind this discussion, this debate? And indeed, what I would say is, the politics of immigration is everywhere. It's here in the US, it's in other countries. Think of Brexit, the US elections in 2016. We can think of the French elections. We can think of the upcoming Swedish elections. Think of all the debate that's going on right now about DACA and Dreamers and border walls. Immigration is and ultimately political outcomes everywhere. It's here in the US. It's another country. The rationale for the session, because we had two sessions, we had a morning one and this is the afternoon session. The rationale is truly to understand or start to make sense of it. A sense of immigration and immigrant sentiments or attitudes towards immigration and immigrants and how they play in our politics. And obviously, having this event in Texas, which is the epicenter of the immigration debate for a variety of reasons. You have a long border with Mexico on the one hand. You have a long history of cross-border pollination. So we're at the epicenter, and we're super excited to be here to be debating this issue specifically. Now, as I was saying before, we had a morning session. We had 8 academic papers presented. It was super fascinating. Different cuts and angles, looking at some of the issues in the U.S., other issues around the world, the issue of immigration and nativist beliefs in cross-national perspective. That ultimately, we believe, will become published papers, scientific papers. We don't have a date. It's to be determined when that will all be done, but super fascinating. And obviously, the afternoon session is for the public. We want to take our debate internally and open it to the public and really sort of dive down deep into this issue, which is immensely impactful when it comes to political outcomes, and it's happening across the world, as I was saying before. Before I move on and I introduce the people on the panel, I want to define things. Immigration makes sense. Changing politics makes sense. What is nativism? And I just want to have a very technical definition of it, because often we think of it when we first hear it in pejorative or negative terms, and that's not what we mean. Actually, as I define it, nativism is the policy of or predisposition toward protecting the interests of native-born over that of foreign-born. And what I tell everyone when I talk to them is everyone's a little bit nativist. I think most everyone would agree that we shouldn't probably have absolutely open and free borders. People probably should have visas. Obviously, there's a continuum along which we have, stronger or weaker nativist feelings, and obviously we'll discuss that today in more detail. So let me turn to the panel. It's a wonderful panel. The first person it's to my left, right? It's to your right, to my left, is Darren R. Shaw. He's a professor at the University of Texas. He's widely published, multiple books as well as articles. He's an Americanist. I just learned that term today, Americanist. That means he focuses on American politics. But he's just not an academic. He actually has a number of stints on the campaign side. He worked in Bush's campaigns in 2000, 2004, and has immense and intense experience on the political side. Sitting next to him is Kyle Kondik. He is the editor-in-chief of The Crystal Ball. And for all of you that are political junkies out there, The Crystal Ball is that newsletter that comes out once per week out of the University of Virginia. I get it every week. I'm always sort of waiting in anticipation for it. He's an Americanist too. I don't know if he defines himself as such, but his focus is on the U.S. and U.S. politics. Sitting next to him is Marshall Foucault. He's a professor at Sciences Po in France. He's an Americanist. He is not an Americanist, indeed. I don't know if you can say, are you a Frenchist? I don't know about that, but he's going to give us a perspective from Europe, continental Europe, especially France. And sitting next to him is Ray Dutch. He's at the Nuffield College, University of Oxford. He's going to give the perspective, widely published, won an award for a book on economic voting. I thought it was more specifically the economic vote. And he's going to give the perspective. He works on immigration writ large. He's done a number of things. He's going to help us also give a perspective on the UK and how the UK is going through its sort of trials and tribulations post-Brexit. And finally, next to him is Chris Garman. Chris Garman works at Eurasia Group. Eurasia is a political consultancy. He's a managing director of the Americas. And he's going to give us perspective in part of how immigration and nativist politics impacts the internal dynamics of countries, more specifically Mexico. But more importantly, he's going to give us a market perspective. How do markets look at this emergent politics, emergent immigrant politics? How are they sort of organizing themselves? Are they resilient vis-a-vis it? What are the sorts of things and inputs they take into calculation? when looking towards the future. So I really want to thank this very august and distinguished panel. And my idea is a bit of the following. I want to moderate for maybe a half an hour. I'm just kind of like, let's see if that actually works out. But I want to moderate for about a half an hour. I have some set questions. The first one everyone has to answer. After that, I'll ask a few more questions. We're going to riff off that. I'd like to open it up for some time to the audience because my experience is that for at least a half an hour, 20 minutes, a half an hour, my experience is, we really get going in a good flow of back and forth. We can pick people's brains. People, if they couldn't go deep into a specific issue in the Q&A, they can really kind of pick up a thread and go dive down deep. So without further ado, let's start. And my first question is, and this is writ large, a broad question, is immigration and nativist sentiment having an impact on politics? Okay, that's a very broad question, but it's a direct question. Maybe it's a difficult one. And what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to talk to the Americanists first. They're going to discuss it in relationship to the United States, more specifically to the 2016 election. If they want to extrapolate that on that, that's fine, and then we'll move forward talking to each of our panelists and come back and sort of have some reflections. So why don't I turn it over to you, Darren, and just ask the simple question, is immigration and nativist sentiment having an impact on politics in the U.S.?
Sure. I'll start narrow and try to make sure that we're giving everybody an opportunity to answer these questions, especially at the outset, to their satisfaction. So I'll confine my observations up front to the 2016 presidential election, and then we can talk about moving backward or, certainly moving forward, the extent to which these sorts of issues play into people's perceptions of politics and elections. You might be surprised, given how much attention is paid to American politics and the most recent presidential election, but Nadine Gibson and I have sort of looked at this empirically for this conference, and there actually haven't been too many analyses that take into account all the disparate factors that we think were at play in the last election. So just off the top of my head, we can talk about socioeconomic issues, class, race, nativism, as we've been talking about, immigration issues, social issues, religion, all of these things. And we could go on and on about the things that impacted vote choice in the last presidential election. And what we tried to do in the paper that we presented earlier was actually disentangle some of these things. And we did a sort of a narrow version of that and a broad version. The narrow version highlighted a couple of issues that, after controlling for all these other factors, still seem to have a very, very powerful effect on the vote. And the two issue opinionations that we thought were really kind of fascinating. One was probably fairly obvious to you, opinion on the border wall. It was highly correlated with Trump's support for Donald Trump. In fact, if you look at the statistics, it was about 4 times as powerful as any other single issue predictor. It wasn't quite as powerful for explaining Hillary's vote. Obviously people with the opposite point of view more likely to vote Hillary Clinton, but it was twice as powerful as any other single predictor of her vote. The other issue, which was much less obvious, I think, was attitudes towards businesses being compelled to offer services to gay couples, which certainly surprised me as a predictor. It was a very powerful, second most powerful distinguisher between Trump support and Clinton support in the last election cycle. Other elements of nativism or nativist sentiment fell away once you controlled for party identification. So a lot of the sorts of things we're going to talk about in the United States have begun to align with party, and we can kind of disentangle that. The second observation I'd have that's much broader is that we found that there is a very sort of important structuring principle to people's reaction to political candidates in 2016. The first is obvious. First dimension to competition is traditional left-right. People sort of organize things that way, and they conceptualize candidates as representing, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders on the left, Trump and Pence and Jeb Bush and others on the right. But there's another dimension that explains a lot of variance in attitudes towards politicians, and that's something that we have explored and called a reform versus establishment dimension. And what we found is that candidates who talk about the system being broken, the system being corrupt, government being incompetent, that people really that resonates with the way people understand what's going on in politics today. And we found that the candidates in 2016 did not well represent that sentiment. There's a little bit of distinction between early on Trump and the other Republican candidates. But by the fall, neither Clinton, certainly, who has all sorts of trouble tapping into reformist anti-establishment sentiment for obvious reasons. But even Trump begins to look more like kind of a conventional Republican. So, and as we go through these conversations, I like to come back to this notion, because I think it works cross-nationally, of voters out there increasingly prone to seeing politics in terms of the establishment and what they would like to view as the anti-establishment and what we call reform. So that's my Nichols version, at least.
If you remember the movie Spinal Tap,
and we all do.
And of course we all do, and if you haven't seen it, you should see it. There's this famous part where one of the members of the band is talking to the Rob Reiner's character, who's Marty DeBurgi, and he's doing the fake documentary, and he shows them the speakers, and he says, this one goes up to 11, and he turns it up to 11, and Rob Reiner doesn't really know what to do about that. It's this very kind of funny scene, but the way I think about Trump actually is that I think he took the traditional Republican viewpoints on a lot of things, including immigration, and basically turned it up to 11. And I think there's some evidence that basically indicates that Trump was able to sort of activate maybe some nativist tendencies in voters and to really change the electorate in a lot of places that were traditionally Democratic. And I wanted to refer to some research by Ryan Enos at Harvard. His very good book out recently called The Space Between Us, and he looked at the 2016 election, and what he found was that Trump improved on Mitt Romney's vote the most in a lot of places that went from having almost no immigrants to having kind of a small noticeable amount over the last 15 years. And one of the places he identified was Luzerne County, which is in Pennsylvania, in the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area, traditionally kind of a Democratic-leaning area. It had a 600% growth rate in Hispanics from 2000 to presently, and that was a county that shifted very strongly from voting for Obama to actually voting in kind of a landslide way for Trump. And so I think that throughout the campaign, and we saw this in the president's many kind of controversial, to say the least, comments about immigration, it didn't really seem to hurt him all that much. In fact, I think maybe it helped, particularly in the Republican primary. And I think what we had was a candidate who did not feel compelled to stick with maybe the sort of polite conversation on immigration. And frankly, I think he benefited from it, and in enough places that he was able to win a very close election. And really, if you look at the voting patterns throughout the country, even though, nationally it really didn't change that much, Obama won by about 4, and then Clinton actually won the national popular vote by 2, so it's not that big of a change. But if you look at the individual county level and even at the statewide level, you see these wide swings. And Clinton did a lot better than Obama did throughout the Sun Belt in places that are growing and affluent and highly educated. But in the Midwest, in some of the very electorally very important swing states, Trump ran well ahead of Romney, not just at the statewide level in a lot of states, but also at the county level. You could sort of see in the county level results the places that had a lot of immigration, that maybe felt like they were sort of the victims of globalization, and that goes back in some places to the 70s and the collapse of steel and other heavy industry in the United States. And basically what happened, I think, is that the president was able to trade, or actually, if you look at it from Clinton's perspective, Clinton traded useful votes in the Midwest for kind of useless votes in the Sun Belt, and the voting pattern sort of broke in Trump's favor. And so, I think that again, Trump took, I think the Republican Party was sort of trending toward maybe a greater sense of nativism on the immigration question, and then Trump sort of took it and again turned it up to 11, and again, I think it really helped him in a very close election.
Great. And before we go on to Marshall, just so I can recap here, because a lot of things have been said. So the first is, anti-establishment sentiment. I think we're going to come back to that, and indeed I want others to talk on it as well. We don't have to do it right this second. Obviously, Chris can bring in Latin America, his immense experience there, and how populism and anti-establishment sentiment sort of plays a role in politics. But could you at least say that in one way or another, nativism, whether it's directly or another way, and immigration played a role in this election, right? That's fair to say.
Yeah, I think so. One other thing, too, is you have to look at not just the politics, but also sort of what's happening in the United States, and that is the United States is definitely becoming a more diverse country. We have much more immigration than than we used to. There were some legal changes, and I won't go into the details of it, but basically immigration was slashed quite significantly in the 1920s, and so the percentage of actually foreign-born people in the United States was cut significantly throughout the middle of the 20th century. In the 1960s, we revised those laws. You start to see the number of foreign-born Americans going up, or foreign-born people living in the United States going up pretty significantly, to the point where we have, I think, about 13 or 14% of Americans are foreign-born, and that's noticeable across the country. And if you go back to the Ryan Enos research, I think that's something that people pick up on, and at a gut level can be kind of hostile to. And he has some experiments in his book where he sort of, I think, kind of proves that.
Okay, great. Marshall, what about France? How does immigration and nativist sentiment play a role? How has it played a role, especially looking back at the presidential elections last year?
Well, so I confirm I'm not an Americanist. So I think that there are some similarities between what happened in US and France. I mean, the main difference, to respond to your question, are how immigration may affect and could transform the political system. We don't have a two-party system, so it means that no party, no candidate, no leader is able to attract immigration as a hot issue. There is only one party, the far-right party, Front National, with the leader, Marine Le Pen. And in France, immigration, and more recently, was not an issue. During many years, beginning of the 80s, immigration was absolutely not handled by political parties. So only one party, Front National, during 40 years now, has only focused on immigration, with different perspectives. The first was the perspective of sovereignty, how France in the Europe could continue to entertain this grandeur de la France with some new migrants and so on. For other mainstream parties, they didn't really talk about immigration, because first, the number of people asking for visa, citizenship in France was quite limited, about 30,000 every year. And after the refugee crisis in 2016 and the decision of Germany to welcome 1 million refugees, it has been absolutely like a shock for many French people, to say. In a sense, in one side, we have to welcome this wave of migrants, but in the other side, all mainstream parties were totally convinced that France has not the capacity to welcome so many people. So there was a tension in 2016, and the time is important because it was just 1 year before the presidential election. So during the campaign in 2017, in fact, immigration remained just an issue for far-right party, and the other candidate, conservative candidate, Macron, the new president candidate, they just don't talk about immigration during the campaign. Why? Because they knew that there is a huge political risk to debate with far-right leader about immigration. What kind of political risk? The risk is to maintain and to exacerbate the capacity of far-right party to gain more votes on that issue. And what happened for the last 40 years, just an illustration, this party, Front National, emerged in 1983, only 6% of the vote share, and 40 years later, the same party now receive 35%. and on only one dimension, immigration. But what is totally new, immigration for the far-right party was just a question of nativism, racism, xenophobia, and it becomes an economic issue. Just to, to focus on the economic consequences to have a more benevolent immigration policy. So during this campaign, what was very fascinating and to some point puzzling, the President Macron, candidate during the campaign, now president, has never talked about immigration. Only one statement saying that France has to do its best to welcome more people. But since 2 months now, as president, we observe a change of his policy. And just an illustration, the government decided to restrict conditions for asylum seekers, and they decided to increase the number of illegal migrants to be deported. So it means that, there is a paradox in France and probably in other European countries. The paradox is you have, in average, 55 to 60% of people, and French people, who are against a more open immigration policy. So it's totally consistent with some position of this far-right party, but in the same time, you have 60% of French people considering that it's not acceptable to not rescue such refugees. So for the moment, in conclusion, we have this new government which tried just to put aside this question, saying that it's not a French regulation, it's a European regulation. So we don't have a specific policy regarding migration. We are just have to meet European requirements, and if we are forced to deport refugees, it's not our will, it's just the European regulation.
Okay, great. And so I heard a couple things there we'll come back to, but first, yes, in one way or another, immigration nativist sentiment is playing a role in politics in France. You talked about triggers and immigration flows, and we're going to want to come back to that in a bit. Ray, what about Brexit? What about the UK? What's up there?
So it's the UK is a really good, really interesting case. I think a couple things. One is it's really important to, I think, distinguish. A lot of people consider the Brexit result to be similar to the Trump result, and I really that I think is incorrect for a number of reasons that hopefully I can explain. Immigration did play an important role in the British election just prior to the Brexit referendum. There's no doubt about that. The UKIP party did very well. The conservative candidates who ran on immigration themes did very well. But I think there's an important distinction between what we see in the United States regarding immigration and what we see in the UK, in my opinion. And since I've lived in the United States for many years, it's something that sort of jumped out at me, and that is that there wasn't the same sort of nativist, intolerant rhetoric about immigration that I think you do see in the United States, and I think you see much less of that in the UK. I think the UK immigration debate was very much grounded in this notion of The UK has a very generous welfare state. It has like the United States, it has very few regulations on hiring. So there's no national identity card. You automatically qualify for welfare benefits. Unlike continental Europe, where if you don't meet all of these sort of residency requirements and have a national identity card, it's very difficult to participate in the labor force. In the UK, it's very easy. It's very much like the United States. And I think the problem in the UK prior to Brexit was that there were a lot of lower middle class voters who felt a real strain was being put on the very generous welfare state. And that's why they reacted. That's where the UKIP support came from. That's why the Conservatives won the election just prior to Brexit. But I think the tenor of the immigration debate was much different. The other interesting difference is that obviously people were very surprised by the Brexit outcome, and clearly the Brexit outcome was, for the most part, driven by concerns about immigration. But it's important to realize that that was not the only issue driving the Leave vote in the Brexit campaign. There were lots of middle class entrepreneurs, sort of the bourgeois class, who were very concerned about remaining in Europe. They perceived Europe as imposing serious regulations on business. Europe, at the point of the Brexit vote, was really a basket case, right? They had Greece, they had an inability to deal with the arriving refugees. So people perceived it as being a problem, right? And Brexit obviously was an opportunity to relieve the voters of the problem, which is a big part of what happened in the Brexit vote. The other interesting thing that's happened post-Brexit, I think, regarding immigration is that unlike the United States, where I think the Republican Party has sort of lost control of the immigration debate as a result of the emergence of Trump, the Conservative Party has not, and neither has the Labour Party. The Conservative and Labour elites still control things, and in fact, post-Brexit, the two-party system is much stronger in Britain now, and the Conservative and Labour elites basically are in a much better position to control the debate about immigration. So I don't see post-Brexit and post-exit from Europe as being one in which immigration and sort of anti-immigrant policies will run amok.
Great. And Chris, what about sort of the immigration debate and all the ruckus here in the U.S.? How's that impacting the dynamics, the political dynamics in other countries? Let's say specifically Mexico. Do you have some insights there? I know that Nieto went through some issues relative to Trump, the back and forth, and it didn't do well for his approval ratings. But that's as much as I know because I'm just a pollster. So, so can you go into more detail?
No, absolutely. No, that's. I think that if I were to give a one-liner answer to that question, and I'll explain, is that it's probably having less of an impact in near-term Mexican politics than you would expect, and that meets the eye. But I absolutely think it has the potential to become a much more important issue for the political narrative in Mexico. And let me explain. Yes, absolutely. The fact that you had the U.S. presidential election cycle, candidate Donald Trump, and then President Trump kind of hammering on Mexico as a target, the wall, that played poorly on the other side of the border, the very, let's say, jumbled and kind of the mishandling of the invitation for Trump to come to Mexico and kind of the way that whole was managed, that was a blowback domestically for President Enrique Peña Nieto in a context where his approval ratings were already very low. Certainly that didn't help, right? And we're headed towards for an election cycle in 2016. And we have a more populist leftist candidate in Manuel López Obrador, who is running against more conservative centrist candidates. And he is taking on a bit more of an anti-corruption, anti-system narrative that can include partial of an anti-U.S. narrative. But what's interesting to see is that the terms of the debate in Mexico don't really have that much to do with what's going on in the U.S., because what we're going through in Mexico is a very deep disenchantment with the political establishment. Issues of corruption are really dominating the national narrative. It's issues of lagging growth. It's issues of security, right? And so that, in terms of the Achilles heel of the candidates aligned, or at least of the current, Priista government and their candidates, it has less to do with being attached or the kind of, let's say, the relationship with the U.S. Now, so I don't think that this year's elections will be as driven by kind of anti-U.S. sentiment, but I think it has the potential to become a very important issue going forward, depending upon the election outcome itself. Because if Manuel López Obrador wins the election, now we're going to have two presidents that think NAFTA is a bad deal, and for very different reasons, right? And if you have a leftist kind of president that is elected on an anti-establishment and a case that the system is broken, and you have the NAFTA negotiations open, and you have the midterm elections coming here in the United States, and if Trump starts to really pick on the NAFTA and the target of Mexico, then López Obrador could use the Trump immigration narrative here in the U.S. to his political purposes to be able to keep his domestic political support, right? And so in other words, it could transform into a tier 1 issue when paradoxically right now it's not as much of a tier 1 issue as you would imagine, kind of just being on this side of the board and expecting what it was. But that said, I would say that during this election cycle, before the July presidential elections, if we do have Donald Trump firing away or threatening to withdraw from NAFTA, or that narrative will feed into López Obrador's campaign, right? But I don't think it's as much of a driver as you would have expected otherwise.
Great. And to the next question. And so, listen, we might not have absolute consensus. There's differences of opinion as to the degree and the weight, but in one way or another, immigration and native settlements playing a role in defining political outcomes, elections, let's say, to be very concrete. We can look at policy as well. And so the question I have is, why are we seeing this all now? Why do we have the UK, France, the US, take a multitude of other countries in continental Europe that are going through these sort of growing pains with the issue of immigration and native settlement? Like, is there something in common? Is there some sort of common linchpin there? Is it something new? Why are we seeing this? So I'll just kind of leave that sort of general question.
One thing I was just looking at was that basically the percentage of people living in countries who are not born there, foreign born in an individual country, and in a lot of the countries we're talking about, not all of them, but in a lot of basically the most kind of affluent, advanced democracies in the world, be it the United States or many countries in Europe, you are seeing an actual increase in terms of foreign-born people in those countries, and if you believe that if the dominant racial group, white people in the United States or ethnic Germans in Germany or whatever, if they're noticing more people who basically look different than them, then that can upset them in certain ways, and so maybe that's something. But I can't say that I've looked at it systematically, but I did sort of notice that when I was looking at it earlier today.
Traditional theory doesn't give us a whole lot here in the American case. Traditional theory says that economic deprivation is sort of a trigger for these kinds of reactions, right? You're looking for a scapegoat. You're looking for the Polish plumber, right? For those of you who are familiar with the European context, right? Someone who comes in and takes jobs away. If that were the case, then nativist sentiment would have been ascendant in the United States in 2008, and in probably to a lesser extent in 2012. And I'm not sure that's true. I'm not big on elite-based theory as a behaviorist. However, I think it's inescapable in the American context that what you're seeing is some enterprising politicians who kind of understand, natively, I hate to use that phrase, the power of these issues in providing a frame for politics. But in the American case, I mean, my contention, and the data are not definitive here, but my contention is that in some ways immigration and trade are markers for Trump's claim that the government's broken. Right? You can't secure the border. You can't do the basic thing that a president or government is responsible for doing. Right? A trade agreement. The trade deals are terrible. Right? They're negotiated by amateurs. I could do better. In that sense, and again, I'm not saying there's not a race component to this. There clearly is. But it strikes me that an underrated aspect of the way Trump has framed the issue is to use it as a marker for some of these other broader conceptions that people have about their government failing them in some ways. So, and I don't know whether that's the case in Europe. My sense is that there is a little bit of that, although I think it's more complicated for...
Well, I think that's a good point, although the interesting thing about the UK, of course, is that there was an entrepreneurial politician prior to the Brexit. He did very well, right? Neil Farage, he did very well. And in the most recent election, the party has basically disappeared, right? So, I mean, what do we say? How do we interpret that, right? I mean, has immigration now disappeared as a policy issue? I don't think so.
Well, I think in the American context, one of the problems is if you run as a reformer and you win, you own the keys to the house.
That's true.
And there come these questions of, in the American case, we talk a lot about 1992 as being an interesting example with Ross Perot. Ross Perot was brilliant at articulating a grievance. Right? Government can't balance its checkbook. It's fundamentally broken. And we were speaking earlier, I don't think anybody really cares that much about the budget deficit as an issue, except as a marker that the government's incompetent. And he used that issue to bring that to life. But if you actually win and you have to fix things, it becomes a little problematic. And we've seen this. We were talking also about the cases of, Chavez in Venezuela, or some of these, charismatic politicians who run as populists and win, but then they've got to fix things, or they become the establishment, and what do you do? Chavez was interesting to me because he continued to point to the United States and say, well, we'd be doing great, except the U.S. keeps keeping us down. In the American case, I'm not quite sure what you do if, you really run and win as a reformist candidate. By the way, I don't think Trump actually tapped into that. I think he just has sort of a feel for the sort of politics. I don't think that's how he fundamentally understood the election. And he hasn't necessarily followed through on a lot of these things. The whole draining the swamp issue has not gone real well for him so far. Right? But I think he did kind of get that sentiment in the U.S.
Yeah, just quickly, just kind of follow up there. Do you find, and maybe and if others want to jump in after, that's fine, but do you find that you talked about kind of this reformist approach, the kind of the anti-establishment, anti-system approach that Trump was, in essence, the anti-establishment candidate, and he tried to sort of tap into that. Do you find that his rhetoric was different if you look at it relative to past potential reformers?
Yeah, he actually lines up very well with, interestingly enough, Perot. He seemed to, and by the way, I want to emphasize that the data that we've looked at suggested that he was seen as more of a reform or an anti-establishment candidate in the context of Republican primaries. So back to early 2016, and he was really distinct from, say, Jeb Bush on this issue. But over the course of the campaign, I guess maybe he came to sort of assume more traditional Republican positions on issues, and the establishment moved to him a little bit on questions of immigration, nativism, such that by the end of the election, he was a very imperfect vessel for, it's not like those whose ideal point is they really want a reform candidate strongly preferred Trump. In fact, they viewed him with some suspicion. So I think early on, his rhetoric really did match up with some of these iconoclastic candidates we've seen in American political history. Towards the end, I think he was putting out a lot of fires and trying to moderate at the, and consolidate his base at the same time of, capitalizing on this appeal a little bit. I think just actually I would go, we've been so Trump focused, I'd flip it and say that the real advantage Trump had was he was running against Hillary Clinton, who has no credentials as a reformer.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, she is the ultimate establishment candidate, by virtue of her husband having served 2 terms and her being first lady and a senator and a member of the Obama administration. She could not tap into this except obliquely through appeals to gender. And that, we didn't find that worked particularly well for her.
I'm going to follow up with Chris a bit, but has there been a major party candidate that's besides Trump that's used the term "the system is rigged"? Or is that something new? Is that a new innovation? And I don't know. I don't have the answer to it. In my professional experience, is the first time I heard that sort of concept used at the national level in American politics. I could be wrong. And the reason I say that is because Chris and I have a lot of experience in Latin America, and I want you to bring in a little bit of the perspective of the anti-establishment candidate, and in the context of Latin American politics.
Yeah, no, I think that there's some absolutely fascinating parallels. What we're seeing in underlying voting trends in Latin America and the type of sentiment that we've been seeing in continental Europe and the United States. But there's a difference, right? I mean, I think that a lot of the system is broken in the U.S. and in Europe, as we've been discussing here, is kind of wrapped up with the issue of immigration, right? In Latin America, it's a little bit of a different story, right? Where Latin America went through this tremendous growth cycle during the high commodity prices. Middle-class families kind of rose in economic ascendance during a 15-year period. We've had a lot of kind of leftist administrations and politicians being elected during this economic bonanza and using semi-populist appeals that actually sustained them. Chavez on the one hand being the extreme, but the Kirchners in Argentina, the Workers' Party administration in Brazil. And what we're seeing now is obviously the region suffering from lower growth, but it goes much deeper than that. We're seeing a disenchantment with the political establishment that is running extraordinarily deep. Issues of corruption are rising to a salience that we haven't seen in the region in a very long time. They're one of the top, 1 or 2 kind of issues that voters are caring about. It's a phenomenon that kind of frustrated middle-class expectations after this period of bonanza. Now we have corruption scandals popping up all over the region. And so there absolutely is a tremendous field and room for us to have candidates that campaign on the system is broken. Now, immigration is not the theme to be able to channel that anger. It could be anti-corruption. It could be a mixture of security, right? And so I do think that if in the 2016 election cycle, with heavy elections in Europe and the United States, I think we all kind of understood that some of the sentiment was there, but maybe as political pundits underappreciating its depthness. I do think that we're going to have a similar story at the end of 2018, where we have elections in Brazil and Colombia and Mexico. Right? We had them in Chile, right? And Venezuela, probably not going to be a fair election, but nevertheless, I think we're going to have it's going to be really interesting to see what political entrepreneurs can channel this type of anger, right? And then in the interplay, ultimately as well, kind of what happens with politics in the U.S. and Europe, and then how that after this election cycle in Latin America. And that's where I think that Mexico is really a nexus that we had to pay a lot of attention to, because the issues of immigration then can bleed, right? If you do have the politics here in the U.S., maybe in a context after coming out this huge election cycle in the region.
Great. Marshall or Ray, do you want to comment on these points that I've raised?
Yeah, just a comment, because we didn't talk about that. Probably it's very specific to France. Is in reality, the debate on immigration is also, to some extent, overlapping 2 other debates. First is the debate, and Ray mentioned that this discussion about the welfare state, and we share the same problem between UK and France, because for some people having these attitudes against immigration, they feel that the welfare state must be first dedicated dedicated to French natives. So that's something on which the far-right party is campaigning. And the second dimension of the debate on immigration in France is also connected to the policy of integration of last generations coming in France early 60s. And I mean, for the last 50 years, it was a huge failure about this integration or assimilation policy. So it means that some parties are not really, I mean, main party and mainstream parties are not really comfortable to, develop, to elaborate some migration policies regarding the failure of the past. So, and last but not the least, I know it's not the case for the UK, but the previous conservative president in France, Nicolas Sarkozy, decided to create. It was the first time in France to create the Minister of National Identity, connected to immigration. So the title of the minister was Minister of National Identity and Immigration. And this point is very important to understand why there is, so many tension when we talk about immigration, because it's to some point connected to, it's not. It's true that main migrants coming in France come from Middle East countries and North African countries. And on that point, the issue about national identity is also, for far-right parties, connected to the capacity of the French republicanism to be consistent with secularism. And this question of Islam is also all the time connected to debate on immigration. So you can imagine how much it's complicated for a party to have a clear position on migration and not talking about immigration, integration, religion, Islam, and so on and so on. So it's like a bubble all the time.
Okay, I think you're right, and I think the UK has sort of dodged a lot of those bullets. But I do think that the UK debate about immigration and the impact of immigration does have a lot to do with the sort of breakdown of the state, and part of it is this north-south divide in the UK, sort of between the London area, the southeast, which has been very successful, very excellent, and the northern parts of the country that really are economically disadvantaged and have sort of not reaped the benefits of the sort of economic boom that we've seen in the South. And I think that has overplayed the immigration debate. I think a lot of the success of the politicians who have been working the immigration themes has come from those regions of the country where people perceive the state as having failed them. Okay.
Actually, just one rejoinder, or at least one thing to complement, which I think is interesting. Obviously, at the Eurasia Group, I focus on the Americas, but we also, as a company, we do focus a lot on European politics. And maybe what I would kind of add to the wrinkle is that we had a negative confluence of events on the European continent, or at least in Europe, which is that we had, on the one hand, kind of countries dealing with the wave of migrant crisis, which triggered all these reaction functions, but also we had the European, at least the Eurozone crisis, put tremendous stress on the European Union, and the requisites of managing the Eurozone crisis had to lead to a centralization of the institutions in Brussels, right? And having to deal with the crisis in Greece and having to deal with all the economic challenges from the post-global financial crisis, which, in other words, the institutional solution to the Eurozone crisis only exacerbated the sense sense of disenchantment with the centralized institutions, right? And then you add the migrant crisis with it, so the anti-EU sentiment was uptick, and kind of the migrant crisis fed somewhat into it. It's not as dominant, of course, as the migrant crisis, but I do think it's something to recognize that the elite solution to the Eurozone crisis just made matters worse.
Okay.
Cliff, I was just going to say to your question from earlier about, is there a candidate sort of like Trump in the past and using the kind of rhetoric? And I don't know about the rhetoric, but I actually thought there were some parallels between Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump in terms of Jimmy Carter was, I mean, he had been elected as governor of Georgia, but only one term. He otherwise was kind of a political outsider. He, of course, was coming off of Watergate. There was a lot of disaffection with, with corruption and sort of the political establishment. Carter also came out of a very big primary field as something of a surprise nominee in 1976. Democratic Party really didn't like him all that much, but he got nominated anyway, won a close election. And I've always thought there were some Carter-Trump parallels, even though in terms of their how they act personally, very, very different, I think. But you could see Darren was talking about this sort of Trump as a reformer kind of candidate, at least in some of his rhetoric, and I think that Carter may have been that way in some ways too.
The two obvious analogs historically would be the social prophets of the 1930s, so people like Long and Father Coughlin and others who represented this sort of populist strain of thought. And I've heard a few radio broadcasts, and there were some similarities with respect to the rhetoric. And the other one that's, is more incendiary would be George Wallace. Some of you probably heard there's an interesting Whistle Stop podcast with John Dickerson talking about, the rhetoric that Wallace used, comparing it to Trump. And, I haven't done a deep dive into that, but it's an interesting notion anyway.
I also think another figure that is important in the sort of path to Trump was Pat Buchanan, who, interestingly, we're here at the Bush Library. Buchanan challenged Bush 1 in New Hampshire in 1992, and he didn't win, but Buchanan got almost 40% of the vote. And I think sometimes the sitting president who has a little bit of primary problems can be a bad indicator for November, and I think that was for Bush in 1992. But Buchanan also sort of comes out of that Wallace school, and I also say, that was also the year of Perot. There was this, I can't remember the name of the academic from the 1970s, but he came up with this term. The voters were called MARS, Middle American Radicals, and there are certain candidates who have fit this sort of Mars mold or appealing to those voters. Trump is certainly one of them, but Wallace, Buchanan, Perot also in that group.
Yeah, Marshall.
No, just one point, because it's just a question for you as pollster in the US.
Well, thank you.
No, because for the last presidential campaign in France, we have measured with open-ended question, what is the most important problem for you? And immigration was the third most important problem for French electorate, only 10%. First, economy, as usual, and second issue was security, order and security. So I was wondering, is there a problem with the measurement of what is an important problem? Because we pay so much attention on immigration, and probably that political parties or political scientists are wrong about the hierarchy of most important problems. Because when we observe what happens in different countries, immigration seems to be more important to explain the attitudes of electorates than measured classically with our most important problem question. So I was just wondering if we are, because it's not your. I don't want to blame pollster, because we are also responsible when we craft a question and so on. But I'm just wondering if immigration is not really accurately measured or appreciate with different polls.
Oh yeah, and we're also playing for getting the elections wrong, right? Yeah, we go through that a lot, especially in the last year or so. No, but my response to that is the following. So what is he talking about? Probably, if I had one question to put on a poll, it would be what's the main problem in the given country? There's a variety of things you can do, but you understand how voters are seeing the world, how they're prioritizing things, how they're evaluating governments and politicians and other sorts of government entities. But those typical questions only have concrete policy items terms. So like immigration, jobs in the economy, healthcare, and there's aspirational and cultural sort of dimensions as well. And so in my mind, immigration has a lot to do with cultural identity as well, not just the specific policy prescriptions or outcomes. And in presidential elections, and Chris and I work a lot together on presidential elections, we have two big ones coming up, Mexico and Brazil, we mix and match. So we put policy items in there together with aspirational attributes, so we try to capture the non-concrete side of how people go about reflecting. So my critique would be, I actually agree with you, probably immigration, people are thinking of it in very concrete terms for the most part, and there's a cultural identity side to it, and there's an identity politics side to it in many of these countries, and probably those questions don't do a good job of capturing that aspect of the immigration and nativist sort of debate. That's my take.
Cliff,
Quick, well, I just know when during the Brexit campaign, we looked at polling results that sort of asked people about immigration, but we also looked at social media conversations about immigration, and I think to a large extent, or to some extent at least, the respondents in these surveys self-censor. They don't, I mean, they tend to understate their concerns about immigration or feel uncomfortable expressing their attitudes. But if you look at social media conversations, they're not uncomfortable about talking about it. And so you really did have this quite interesting sort of disconnect.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we do a lot of polling in Texas, and one of the interesting things is the dichotomy between the most important problem facing the nation, in which case, immigration and border security. I think it's important to make sure that your coding is distinct on these things. We always treat them separately in our sort of presentation of the data, but you can combine them. And you get 10, 12, 13, 14% say it's the most important problem facing the nation. In the state of Texas, it's 35 to 45, and this was at the height of the economic recession. So there's a federalism issue, I think, that plays, and I'd be interested to see what the regional breakdowns are. To Ray's point, I think what we like to do is actually ask what's one of the most important problems facing the country, what's another, and then ask what's the most. We like to prime people to think about some sort of constellation of issues and then ask them at the end of 2 or 3 prompts to respond to which they think is the most important.
Great. Well, unless someone else has something else to say, I said this was going to go half an hour, and we ran over just a little bit. So what we'll do, it just kept on going, right? And they kept on riffing and talking. That's great. So why don't we open it up to the audience for questions?
There was an interesting comment made about social media versus polling, and the results being different. How do you normalize between those, and how do you understand what fraction of the population you're looking at so that you can extrapolate from?
So that's a very good question. During the Brexit campaign, we had a big effort to monitor the social media conversations about Twitter and try to predict or monitor Twitter conversations about Brexit and try to predict the result of Brexit. And we were actually correct, and all of the pollsters were basically wrong. But your point is a good one. Well, how do you determine whether this Twitter traffic or this Twitter conversation is representative of the population? And that's the trick that we spent a lot of time doing. It's not easy to do, but I think increasingly with more sophisticated automated text analyses where we're able to sort of get a better profile of the Twitter users and the socio-demographic background of the people who are tweeting, I think think we're moving in a direction where those social media conversations are becoming a really good indicator of political sentiment, primarily because they're unobtrusive and they're voluntary, right? But we're not there yet, and I think your point is a good one. The challenge is to sort of figure out what the makeup of that social media conversation is.
I think social media is very good at picking up anger and intensity of anger, and that can be almost the best motivator or predictor of maybe who shows up. But I agree that there are challenges. But there's been a lot of interesting little research here and there that suggests that social media sentiment may be a good piece of trying to predict elections.
More questions? Well, I have a question then. How's that? So I'll take the royal prerogative here and then kind of go back to the moderator. So just taking a look at politics today, and we talked about nativist sentiment, we talked about immigration, we talked about anti-establishment feelings, and they're not the same thing, but they're playing off each other. And my question is, have we entered into a new normal writ large, or is that an overstatement? And I'm going to start with you, Chris, and I would like your more market perspective. Like, what are you saying to clients? How are you engaging them? And what do you think?
Yeah. Well, first, I think that's a great question, because we're in this environment where we're all kind of seeing these deep underlying trends. Voters are not happy with respect to political establishments. Issues of nativism have been running very deep. And what I would say is that, as a side comment, financial markets, institutional investors do a very poor job in trying to translate that into what it means for their day-to-day, right? And how to price in that kind of risk. And part of it is by the global economic context. We're living in a world right now where we have growth in the United States, growth in Europe, growth in Asia, economic recovery in Latin America, and so financial conditions are extraordinarily beneficial. So we kind of are living in a world with economic tailwinds, but the underlying political currents, there's a disconnect going on, right? And so what happens is that the financial markets and kind of the private sector, they tend to look at these as one-off issues that they have to pay attention only sporadically. So it's the election, the referendum of Brexit, or an election in the U.S. or the French election. And if you get over the hump, sometimes you come to wrong conclusions. And so oftentimes we had back-to-back in terms of the Brexit and the U.S. election, Donald Trump. And then we had the election of Macron in France. It's like, oh, okay, now the tide is turning against the anti-establishment, anti-EU sentiment, and maybe we're on a different path. But in fact, if you look at underlying voter trends, that's absolutely the wrong conclusion that you should get into. That's just more of I think this is the challenge of the private sector in thinking about these risks. But my sense is that we are in a new normal that's not going to go away anytime soon. Because if you look at maybe whatever the hypothesis it is to explain these issues of nativism and this anti-establishment sentiment, it doesn't seem as if that the drivers for that sentiment are going to go away. Either because we're going to continue with the wave of kind of, let's say, migration is not going to be turned so quickly. The roots of that disenchantment as well. And so, we're probably having a couple election cycles ahead where we're going to have to deal with this. And also governments and leaders that are elected on this platform, they have a hard time maintaining high levels of support. You look at the decay function of approval ratings of President Macron or even Donald Trump. These are low. These are hard expectations to manage. So I think we're headed to a cycle of weak governments in developed markets, and in emerging market economies is a little bit of a different story. Again, it's not always is about nativism and immigration, but we're seeing a deep disenchantment of this frustrated new middle class, and we're headed towards a huge election cycle right now. So, you know, it's hard to say how long that will last, but I do think that that there will be blowback. The one kind of acute issue that we're focused on at Eurasia Group to our clients is what's the impact on trade, and what's the impact on multilateral frameworks like the European Union. Those things can have an impact absolutely on productivity and potential GDP growth. But those are death by 1,000 cuts. It's not necessarily an acute crisis.
Okay. Anyone else from the group want to comment on that? Looking forward further than just...
Well, I would say, looking back and then forward, the notion that this sort of nativist sentiment is, you know, uniquely associated with the 2016 election, of course, is laughable historically. I mean, how many of you have seen the movie Gangs of New York? The Scorsese movie back. You know, anti-Irish, anti-Italian, anti-Jewish. I mean, these are sort of long and dishonorable traditions in American history. What's interesting to me, since you put it this way, Cliff, is the extent to which the particular migration patterns, this is just to the United States, but they came in the 80s and into the 90s, where it's heavily from Latin America, heavily from Southeast Asia and East Asia, whether they represent something different, whether the integration of those groups into American society at this particular time and in this particular part of American economic development, is that going to be fundamentally different? You know, is the e pluribus unum motto still relevant, and how does that occur? And I think that's interesting, and I don't really know what to make of it. So I mean, I think that will absolutely continue to be with us, because I think it's part of the sort of generalized American experience, right? How do you be an open, welcoming country, but maybe face limits that you didn't think of 40 or 50 years ago in the post-war era? I don't know. And how politics grapples with that is really interesting. The ability of the Republican and Democratic parties to effectively express these interests and these issues, to me, is an extraordinary challenge. That actually is the thing that concerns me most about this. And it's not just accommodating, say, a frustrated middle class. Think about it from the other side, the point of view, which is the parties have done a miserable job of representing the interests of Asian American and Hispanic Americans. I mean, you know, you could say, well, aren't Hispanics Democrat? Marginally so, but the defining characteristic of Hispanic and Asian populations in the United States is they're not that interested, they're not that engaged, they're not that involved, because the parties have not articulated a politics that speaks to them. And that's a challenge, and everybody in marketing in the United States wants to crack that nut, right? The old sleeping giant metaphor that we're so familiar with in Texas, and nobody's figured it out yet. And if people in the audience are good at that, you can make yourself a lot of money, not to be too cynical. But there is a political consulting firm that would love to hire you, I'm sure.
Anyone else want to comment on?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I sort of see, from the European perspective at least, that maybe along the lines of what Darren was saying is that there was this political situation in Europe that was not a stable equilibrium. That the electorates in France and Spain and Germany and Italy were deeply uncomfortable with the status quo, right? And to some extent, I see the election in Britain as to some extent a wake-up call to Europe that basically said, okay, let's rethink, or forcing the parties to sort of rethink the solutions they were going to propose to the electorate. And I think the French outcome was partially in that direction. But I think the equilibrium was not sustainable. It wasn't a sustainable equilibrium, and I think in the next set of election cycles, I think we'll see hopefully a stabilization, maybe.
Marshall?
Yeah, it was like a disruptive election, but to some point the American election was also disruptive for the political system. No, I think that will be very important and relevant to look for the next months or next years. I mean, this question about immigration, for me, immigration, it's not it's not only, or it's no longer a question of left and right, or conservative and Democrats. I think we observe, and especially in Europe, that such question is more close to what some political scientists call the cultural divide. So it means that, and we talk about that this morning, so it means that now what is complicated for conventional, traditional political parties is to be able to formulate policies according to two different axes, left-right and cultural liberalism or cultural conservatism. And now immigration, we see that we have a connection of European populist parties able to put immigration as a cultural conservatism cue, and also on the left, but also on the right. So it means that for me, for the future, and especially in France, I don't see another party than the far-right party, Front National, able to, in terms of issue ownership, to be no other party is able to handle this issue, immigration, as Front National did it in the past. So for Macron, his position is very, I don't know which word to use, so balanced, polite, but they don't want to be too much in the front on migration policy, because, and to finish on that, what is very fascinating, now we observe that the electoral, the vote of migrants, so people coming in France in 60s and 70s were usually more likely to vote for left parties. Now it's no longer the case. First, they abstain a lot. For the second and third generation, and for the first generation, immigration is so much perceived as a trouble, a concern for the society as a whole, that they are more prone, and they tend, and we have observed that for the last presidential election, first generation migrants are more prone to vote for parties that will make this issue as like a protective issue. They don't want to be more, viewed and perceived as a problem for the society. So they are less and less prone to vote for, left parties who have promoted migration policies. So we have a reverse in the society concerning the vote of migrants.
Great, thank you, Marshall. I think we're going to close out here, but before I close out, I want to leave a couple data points, because I have strong opinions. I didn't voice them really here, but I'm a structuralist. I believe in the broad brushstrokes of history in terms of demographics, and I'll leave some demographic data points here before we close out. In the U.S., there's 45 million immigrants. 13% of our population is foreign-born. That's the highest since the turn of the last century. And obviously, Kyle spoke a bit about spikes over the course of our history in the percent foreign-born, but we're at the highest level, and it's only increasing since the turn of the last century. The other data point, Europe, approximately the same size as the U.S., approximately the EU, 47 million immigrants, 11% foreign-born, the highest in the history of the EU. And so, independent of everything else, the structural factors, demographic factors, or triggers, if you want to call them, are there. And I have no doubt in my adult lifetime as a professional that immigration, nativist sentiments will have impacts on politics above and beyond the specifics of any given policy or any given sort of reflection. So I want to thank the panel. It was an awesome panel. I want to thank all of you for coming. C-SPAN taped this. There'll be a tape delay, but we'll actually be on TV, and we can clip ourselves out there and send them to our loved ones. But I want to thank everyone for coming.
Yeah.
What? 2 in the morning. Well, I was in Asia before I came here.
Let me give you my. I think we go over here and pick us up some. Get carted around, I think. I believe you went back to the UCLA. Is that how you know? For dinner again? No. Well, I met him at we were at São Paulo. I saw Cliff, and then Cliff was with Guy. Okay. I met him. I would not ever meet him otherwise. He went down to Brazil.